Hey guys, I hope you've enjoyed the channel so far. Now, on a lot of my videos I've mentioned this is something that I've really wanted to do. Part of the reason it's been delayed is I've wanted to speak to the relevant people to make sure that they're okay with me doing this. I am aware that one of them watches the channel, so hope you enjoy the video. Let me know how it is. The reason I wanted to do this video is about this time in February, a friend of mine committed suicide. She was a wonderful woman, and she was someone very, very dear to me. She didn't tell anyone that she was ill, or rather, we did know that she was ill, but we didn't know to the full extent that she was ill. I mean, the first I heard about it was when a friend of my father's phoned me and basically said I needed to contact my dad. My dad was uncontactable until later in the evening when I was told that my friend, and originally I was just told my friend had died. Um, so that was kind of hard for me to bear. I kind of buried myself into my work. This video is mainly to let people know that they can talk to people, but one of the other reasons is because the thing that I've always hated when it comes to the subject of suicide is people say that um, the victim in question, shouldn't have committed suicide. They should have just appealed for help. They should have done this and done that. And they're weak if they commit suicide. They're horrible people if they commit suicide. And until you've actually been on that darkened stage, on that edge of the abyss, no one will truly know what it feels like. Um, and then I read this passage, and I think this passage is the closest feel to what's going through someone's head when they're committing suicide. So I wanted to read this passage. I'm going to continue reading up to the bit where it ends to say, because there's a bit at the end where you can sort of get a feel of someone finally being able to break out, which is what we want to encourage people to do in order to let people know that there are people out there that they can speak to, friends, family. Um, there's there's Samaritans out there, and there are people out there more aware of the kind of kind of thing that happens and what goes in people's heads. It's not just someone wakes up one morning and they're gonna die by the end of the day. It's something a lot more devastating and a lot more harder to bear than that. The passage I'm going to read is from Neil Gaiman's Neverware, and it's the beginning of chapter 12. Um, I'll give you a brief synopsis on what has happened. The main character, Richard Mayhew, has agreed to a challenge, but until we read the passage, we don't know what the challenge is. And it gives a very good idea. It's also slightly into the kind of homelessness as well, but this is particularly suicide. What goes through someone's head when they're on that edge and unsure of what to do. So I think this passage definitely says everything about it. Richard Mayhew walked down the underground platform. He didn't recognise the station. It was a District Line station. The sign said Blackfriars. The platform was empty. Somewhere an underground train roared, driving a ghost wind down the platform, which scattered a copy of the Sun into its component pages, breasts and inverted scurrying and tumbling off the platform and down onto the rails. Richard looked from one side to another. Then he sat down on a bench and waited for something to happen. Nothing happened. He rubbed his head and felt slightly sick. There were footsteps on the platform. He looked up. There was a prim-looking girl walking past him, hand in hand with a woman who looked like a larger, older version of herself. They looked at him and then, rather obviously, looked away. "Don't get too near to him, Milani," advised the woman in a very audible whisper. Milani looked at Richard, staring in the way children stare, without embarrassment or self-consciousness. Then she looked back at her mother. "Why do people like that stay alive?" she asked curiously. "Not enough guts to end it all," explained her mother. Milani risked another glance at Richard. "Pathetic," she said. Their feet pattered away down the platform and soon they were gone. He wondered if he had imagined it. He tried to remember why he was standing on this platform. Was he waiting for a tube train? Where was he going? He did not know. He sat there. Was he dreaming? He felt the hard plastic seat beneath him with his hands, stamped the platform with mud-encrusted shoes. Where had the mud come from? Touched his face. No, this was no dream. Wherever he was real. He felt strange, detached and depressed, and horribly, strangely saddened. Someone sat down next to him. Richard did not look up, did not turn his head. "Hello," said a familiar voice. "How are you, Dick? You all right?" Richard looked up. He felt his face creasing into a smile, hope hitting him like a blow to the chest. "Gary?" he asked, scared. "Then you can see me?" Gary grinned. "You always were a kidder," he said. "Funny man, funny." Gary was wearing a suit and tie. He was clean-shaven and had not a hair out of place. Richard realised what he must look like. Muddy, unshaven, rumpled. "Gary, listen, I know what I must look like. I can explain." He thought for a moment. "No, I can't. Not really." "It's okay," said Gary. His voice was soothing, sane. "Not sure how to tell you this? Bit awkward." He paused. "Look," he explained, "I'm not really here." "Yes, you are," said Richard. Gary shook his head sympathetically. "No," he said, "I'm not. I'm you, talking to yourself." Richard wondered vaguely if this was one of Gary's jokes. "Maybe this will," said Gary. He raised his hands to his face, pushed at it, moulded, shaped. His face flowed like silly putty. "Is that better?" said the person who had been Gary, in a voice that was jarringly familiar. Richard knew that face. He had shaven it most weekday mornings since he had left school. He had cleaned its teeth, squeezed its spots, and on occasion wished it looked more like Tom Cruise or John Lennon or... It was his face. "You're sitting on Blackfriars Station at rush hour," said the other Richard. "You're talking to yourself. And you know what they say about people who talk to themselves? It's just you're starting to edge a little closer to sanity now." And the damp, muddy Richard stared into the face of the clean, well-dressed Richard, and he said, "I don't know who you are or what you're trying to do, but you aren't even very convincing. You don't even look like me." He knew he was lying. His other self smiled sadly and shook his head. "I'm you, Richard. I'm whatever's left of your sanity." The other Richard stared at him intently. "Concentrate. Look at this place. Try to see the people. Try to see the truth. You're already the closest you've been in a week to reality." "This is rubbish," said Richard, flatly, desperately. Richard shook his head, but he looked at the platform. Something flickered at the corner of his vision. He followed it with his head, but it was gone. "Look," whispered his double, in a voice that Richard knew too well. He was standing on an empty, dimly lit station platform, a lonely mausoleum of a place. And then the noise and the light struck him like a thunderbolt. He was standing on Blackfriars Station in the middle of the rush hour. People bustled by him, a riot of noise and light of shoving humanity. There was a train waiting in the station. Richard saw himself reflected in its window. This is what he looked like. He looked crazy. He had a week's growth of beard. Food was crusted around his mouth and in his beard. One eye had recently been blackened, and a boil, an angry red carbuncle, was coming up on the side of his nose. He was filthy, covered in a black, encrusted dirt which filled his pores and lived under his fingernails. His eyes were red and blurry. His hair was matted and snarled. He was a crazy, homeless man, standing on a platform of a busy underground station in the heart of the rush hour. He buried his head deep in his hands. When he raised his face, the people were gone. The platform was dark again, and he was alone. A hand found his, held his hand, and then squeezed it. A woman's hand. He could smell a familiar perfume. The other Richard sat on his left. Jessica sat on his right, holding his hand, looking at him. He had never seen that expression on her face before. "Jess," he said. Jessica shook her head. He let go of his hand. "I'm afraid not," she said. "I'm still you, but you have to listen, darling. You're the closest to reality you've been. You people keep saying the closest to reality, the closest to sanity. I don't know what you..." He paused. Something came back to him then. He looked at the other version of himself, at the woman he had loved. "Is this part of the ordeal?" he demanded. "Ordeal?" asked Jessica. She exchanged a concerned glance with the other Richard who wasn't him. "Yes, ordeal. With the Blackfriars who live under London," Richard said. As he said it, it became more real. "There's a key I have to get for this angel called Islington. If I get him the key, he'll send me home again." His mouth dried up and he stopped. "Listen to yourself," said the other Richard. "Can't you tell how ridiculous all this sounds?" Jessica looked as if she were trying not to cry. Her eyes glistened. "You're not going through an ordeal, Richard. You had some kind of nervous breakdown a couple of weeks ago. I think you just cracked up. I broke off your engagement. You'd been acting so strangely, it was like you were a different person. I couldn't cope. Then you vanished." The tears began to run down her cheeks and she stopped talking to blow her nose on a tissue. The other Richard began to speak. "I wandered, alone and crazy, through the streets of London, sleeping under bridges, eating food from bins and skips, shivering and lost and alone, muttering to myself, talking to people who weren't there." "I'm so sorry, Richard," said Jessica. She was crying. Her face contorted and unattractive. Her mascara was beginning to run and her nose was red. He had never seen her hurt before and he realised how much he wanted to take her pain away. Richard reached out for her to try to hold her, to comfort her, to reassure her, but the world slid and twisted and changed. Someone stumbled into him. He was lying prone on the platform in the rush hour glare. The side of his face was sticky and cold. He pulled his head up off the ground. He had been lying in a pool of his own vomit. At least he hoped it was his own. Passers-by stared at him with revulsion, or, after one flick of the eyes, did not look at him. He wiped at his face, tried to get up, but could not remember how. Richard began to whimper. He shut his eyes tightly and he kept them shut. When he opened them 30 seconds or an hour or a day later, the platform was in semi-darkness. He climbed to his feet. There was nobody there. "Hello?" he called. "Help me! Please!" Gary was sitting on the bench watching him. "What? You still need someone to tell you what to do?" Gary got up and walked over to where Richard was standing. "Richard," he said urgently, "I'm you. The only advice I can give you is what you're telling yourself. Only maybe you're too scared to listen." "You aren't me," said Richard, but he no longer believed it. "Touch me," said Gary. Richard reached a hand out, his hand pushing into Gary's face, squashing and distorting it, as if it were pushing into warm bubble gum. Richard felt nothing in the air around his head. He pulled his hand out of Gary's face. "See," said Gary, "I'm not here. All there is you, walking up and down the platform, talking to yourself, trying to get up the courage to..." Richard had not meant to say anything, but his mouth moved, and he heard his voice saying, "Trying to get up the courage to do what?" A deep voice came over the loudspeaker. "London Transport would like to apologise for the delay. This is due to an incident at Blackfriars Station." "To do that," said Gary. "Become an incident at Blackfriars Station. To end it all." Your life's a joyless, loveless, empty sham. You've got no friend. I've got you, whispered Richard. Gary appraised Richard with frank eyes. I think you're a tosser, he said. I've got Dor and Hunter and Anastasia. Gary smiled. There was pity in the smile, and it hurt Richard more than anything else could have done. More imaginary friends. We all used to laugh at you round the office for those trolls. Remember them on your desk? He laughed. Richard started to laugh too. It was all too horrible. There was nothing else to do but laugh. After some time, he stopped laughing. Gary put his hand into his pocket and produced a troll. It had purple hair, and it once sat on the top of Richard's computer screen. Here, said Gary. He tossed the troll to Richard. Richard tried to catch it. He reached out his hands, but it fell through them as if they were not there. Richard went down onto his hands and knees, fumbling for the troll. It seemed to him then as if it were the only fragment he had of his real life. That if he could only get the troll back, perhaps he could get everything back. Flash! It was rush hour again. A train disgorged hundreds of people, and hundreds of others tried to get on, and Richard was down on his hands and knees, being kicked and buffeted by the commuters. Someone stepped on his fingers hard. He screamed shrilly and stuck his fingers into his mouth like a burned child. They tasted very bad. He did not care. He could see the troll at the platform's edge, now 10 feet away. He crawled slowly on all fours through the crowd, across the platform. People swore at him. They got in his way. They buffeted him. He had never imagined that 10 feet could be such a long distance to travel. He heard a high-pitched voice, giggling, and he wondered who it could be. It was a disturbing giggle, nasty and strange. He wondered what manner of person could giggle like that. He swallowed, and the giggling stopped, and then he knew. An elderly woman climbed onto the train, and as she did so, her foot knocked the purple-haired troll down into the darkness, down into the gap between the train and the platform. No, said Richard. He was still laughing, an awkward, wheezing laugh. But tears stung his eyes and spilled down his cheeks. He rubbed his eyes with his hands, making them sting even more. Flash, and then the platform was deserted and dark again. He climbed to his feet and walked unsteadily the last few feet to the edge of the platform. He could see it there, down on the tracks, by the third rail, the live one, a small splash of purple, his troll. He looked ahead of him. There were big posters stuck to the wall on the other side of the tracks. The posters advertised credit cards and sports shoes and holidays in Cyprus. As he looked, the words twisted and mutated. New messages. End it all, was one of them. Put yourself out of your misery. Be a man. Do yourself in. Have a fatal accident today. He nodded. He was talking to himself. The posters did not really say that. Yes, he was talking to himself, and it was time that he listened. He could hear a train, not far away, coming towards the station. He clenched his teeth and swayed back and forth, as if he were still being buffeted by commuters, although he was alone on the platform. The train was coming towards him, and he understood then just how little effort it would take to make the pain stop, to make all the pain go away forever and ever. He pushed his hands deep into his pockets and took a deep breath. It would be so easy, a moment of pain, and it would all be over and done. There was something in his pocket. He felt it with his fingers, something smooth and hard and roughly spherical. He pulled it out of his pocket. A quartz bead. He remembered picking it up then. He had been on the far side of Knightsbridge. It had been part of Anastasia's necklace. And from somewhere in his head, or out of it, he thought he heard the rat girl say, "Richard, hold on!" He nodded and put the bead back into his pocket, and he stood on the platform and waited for the train to come in. It came in, slowed, came to a stop. The train doors hissed open. The carriage was filled with dead people, all sorts of dead people. There were fresh corpses, ragged cuts in their throats and bullet holes in their temples. There were old, desecrated bodies. There were strap-hanging cadavers, covered with cobwebs and messy, cancerous things lolling in their steps. Each corpse seemed, as much as one could tell, to have died by its own hand. There were male corpses and female corpses. Richard thought he had seen some of those faces pinned to a long wall, but he could not remember where any more, could not remember when. The carriage smelled like a morgue might smell at the end of a long, hot summer, during the course of which the refrigeration equipment had failed for good. During the course of which the refrigeration equipment had failed for good. Richard had no idea who he was anymore. No idea what was or what was not true. Nor whether he was brave or cowardly, mad or sane. But he knew the next thing he had to do. He stepped onto the train and all the lights went black.